Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you today and to host this AVERT Research Network Roundtable. I'd like to first start by introducing myself and the AVERT Research Network. My name is Lydia Khalil. I'm a research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute and coordinator of the AVERT Network. I'm also a research fellow at the Lowy Institute. The AVERT Network, the Addressing Violent Extremism and Radicalization to Terrorism Network, is a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional research network that's based in Melbourne, Australia, and it's supported by the Alfred Deakin Institute at Deakin University, but our membership is both across Australia and international. You can find out more about us at the AVERT Research Network website or via our Twitter feed. And today I'm really pleased to be hosting Dr. Imogen Richards, who will be giving us a presentation on identitarianism and the Great Replacement theory within the Australian context. Dr. Richards is a lecturer in criminology at Deakin University and a research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute for Citizenship and Globalisation. Her research is in the areas of social news and alternative forms of online media, and she's also written on the political economy of counterterrorism and the performance of security responses in a social crisis. Imogen's done a lot of terrific work on both the Australian and the international far right, and is going to speak to us today about this very timely topic, about the identitarian movement, the embrace of the Great Replacement theory, conspiracy theory, and how it fits into the wider Australian landscape. But before I turn it over to Dr. Richards, I just want to go over the format for this webinar today. Imogen will begin her presentation and deliver it for us, and then we'll allocate some time for a Q&A afterwards, roughly about 15 to 20 minutes. So we ask that you please put any questions that you have in the Q&A box here. Do not put them in the chat. So I repeat, please put them in the Q&A box, not in the chat function. And feel free to post questions as we go along. You don't need to wait until the end. So with that, I'll hand it over to Imogen. Off to you, and thanks very much for doing this for us.
No worries. Thanks, Lydia. Just bear with me, everyone, while I just set up the screen sharing. Okay. Just double check. Okay. Okay, so hi everyone. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about Australian examples of the far right ideology of identitarianism. Primarily, I'm going to be talking about research that's set out in a forthcoming chapter that I co-authored with Callum Jones, that's due for publication later this year in Routledge's Far Right and Fascism series. Okay, so identitarianism combines a nativist approach to nationalism with a conspiratorial narrative that early migrant or Indigenous white populations are under genocidal threat from more recent non-white migration. As a relatively cohesive social movement, it is driven by an ideology that emerged primarily from the post-1968 French Nouvelle Droite and European New Right through associated foundations, think tanks, press houses, publications such as Continent Europa, Greece, and Arctos, and others. So the academic works of high-profile New Right figures, such as Alain de Benoit and Guillaume Fay, before Fay's leading the European New Right, that I'll probably refer to as the ENR, and his death, also played an important role in the development of identitarianism. So compared to other political tendencies, it's become relatively unique on the far right by virtue of its growth in prevalence, connection to mainstream political institutions, and its cross-national or international characteristics. So its recognition as a discrete and internationally influential ideology partly relates to the establishment and recognition of generational identity, which was and is a pan-European youth movement, which is now proscribed in France, and that derived from the youth wing of the far-right Bloc Identitaire, connected to the former Front National, which is now the National Rally under Marine Le Pen. The Bloc Identitaire, was also renamed to Les Identitaires, and I'll discuss some of the connections with Australian figures later. So the high-profile stunts of generational identity brought identitarian activism to international provenance. So some of these stunts included its members 2017 interfering with a boat transporting refugees across the Mediterranean, and its 2018 declaration of a false Swiss Alps border in respective so-called Defend Europe missions. So GI, or generational identity, was investigated by law enforcement in France after those actions, but it was also investigated in Austria after revelations of practical and financial associations between the network, its leaders, and the Australian perpetrator of the neo-Nazi mass shooting at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand on the 15th of March 2019. So while international GI chapters emerged in Austria, Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Czech Republic, and Ireland, GI-inspired organisations and similar political tendencies were also seen in the UK, where a chapter emerged as well, North America, South America, Canada, Russia, New Zealand, and as I'll look at, Australia. So despite the international influence of identitarianisms and its identitarianism's ideology, and its leaders' cross-national associations with acts of political violence, these aspects have only really been the subject of an emergent body of research. Existing research has also focused on the movement's sort of fringe, radical, extra-parliamentary or extra-institutional elements, and I would say arguably to the neglect of wider support, looking at wider support for identitarian frameworks and concepts within more mainstream political venues. So the significant mainstream absorption of identitarian ideas and new right-inspired concepts is reflected by their promotion within political and media institutions. So for example, the ENR policy of remigration, referring to the forced proposed repatriation of both regular and irregular migrants back to their alleged destinations of origin or alleged ancestral homelands. Significantly influenced 21st century anti-immigration policies in both liberal and social democracies across Europe as elsewhere. And in Europe, these were sometimes collectively termed Fortress Europe, these policies. So rhetorical engagement with variants of a white genocide thesis also has become increasingly prominent in right-wing Anglophone and European media, including through politicians' references in Europe to Eurabia. I can explain that later in the chat if we need to, or alt-right actors as well, signposting of a Zionist occupation government, or in characteristic identitarian discourse, mass media references to the explicitly ENR-inspired Great Replacement theory. So in 2021, for instance, as is often recognized, the US Fox News talk show host Tucker Carlson alleged the existence of a DNC-led plot to promote the demographic replacement of white Americans for the purpose of generating pro-globalization voting blocs within the country. And the Great Replacement was the title of the so-called manifesto of the perpetrator of the mass shooting at Christchurch in 2019. And it was also the subject matter and the primary framing for a documentary. It might have been the title as well, within the title as well, of a documentary produced or published as well online on YouTube by Lauren Southern, which received millions of views, even within a very short space of time, while Southern now, of course, enjoys a regular commentary spot on the Sky News Australia broadcast network. I should say as well, in the context of the mainstreaming and remediation of these, it's noteworthy, I think, that the Sky News Australia network is also broadcast, at least in certain regional settings, sort of free to air within Australia as well now, even after the sort of feature of Southern and others. So I'd also say attending to how these concepts become adapted and remediated can help to reveal some of the movement's inward-facing and its outward-facing characteristics. It can also highlight the relationship a global identitarian movement, such as in the forthcoming book that I mentioned, might hold to the centre of what we can describe as a political sphere of influence. So constituting dominant players, actors, venues within the media and elsewhere, and also their location sort of on a geopolitical scale. Okay, so ideological characteristics of identitarianism vary depending on its different national expressions. So esotericist notions of racial identity tied to land and place connection are important, particularly across Northern and Eastern Europe, including crossover between identitarians and a far-right social movement inspired by Dugin's quasi-Eurasianism. And I say quasi because his sort of version of it is not necessarily in keeping with a dominant conception of Eurasian politics for people even, so people even where the ideology is more dominant. So the importance of place and territory for identitarians is typically guided by the sort of ENR concept of ethno-pluralism. So this refers to a belief system that cultural communities ought to be developed and preserved according to more or less specifically named ethnospheres, conceptualized largely by Fay. So according to this philosophy, the establishment of heterogeneous ethnocultural regions would provide redress to what is seen as an injurious ideology of sameness. So this would represent a right-wing answer to multiculturalism in allowing for the coexistence of unique national cultures via their forced separation. And geopolitically situated, policies of land-based bloc alternatives to an Atlanticist or Carthaginian sea-based world order, currently dominated by the US and UK, would position Europe and parts of Asia, but largely along, specific, quasi-Eurasianist lines instead as a globally centralized landmass. So conspiratorial narratives of national populations' demographic substitution provide this sort of pseudo-intellectual foundation for identitarian actors' opposition to both regular and irregular migration. So for influential activists, tactics for achieving remigration would include the forced repatriation of so-called illegitimate refugees, but also the establishment of camps, according to generational identity, around Europe to house supposedly legitimate ones. So in those leaders' expressed views, this policy would be paired with domestic policies for reducing welfare support for migrants, but not also just first-generation migrants, and de-Islamization programs, banning burqas, but also advocacy of, in some contexts, the banning of minarets and the conduct of religious ceremonies in non-European languages. So proponents would tend to justify these actions by claiming that they service the restoration of a given territory to an indigenous, often white in Europe population. So this is, of course, notwithstanding early histories of migration across the continent, but nevertheless, these ideologies are more difficult to sustain, perhaps in sort of settler colonial states. So in some identitarian accounts, Islam also serves as a proxy issue, highlighting the supposed wider disorder brought about by multi-ethnic societies within Europe and elsewhere. So identitarians tend to argue that remigration represents a non-violent process, though the cases they cite are rarely non-violent. So they've included, for instance, former Ugandan President Idi Amin's forced expulsion from the country of its Asian minority in the 70s, including approximately 80,000 Gujaratis of Indian descent. So the concept of ethno-pluralism is recognised in reality to represent a rebranded form of European nativism, also being termed a form of global apartheid, racial apartheid, or ethnic cleansing. Identitarians also propose to achieve societal support for their policies through the deployment of metapolitics. So derived from the work of neo-Marxist intellectual Antonio Gramsci, metapolitics refers to the social means by which people can attain cultural and intellectual political change within a given society prior to political transformation or revolution. So the concept is often thought to have been appropriated by Fay and de Benoit in the Nouvelle Droite's adaptation of adaptive sort of imitation of techniques from the 68ers, which was the progressivist social and cultural movement that began in Paris and spread around the world. But its writings also lie in the, or its origins, I should say, lie in the writings of historical Italian fascists such as Julius Evola and French neo-fascists such as Dominique Venner and Maurice Bardèche, and sometimes that's perhaps under-recognised. It also plays on the idea of leveraging contemporary media to achieve ideological hegemony, which would be with the aim of contributing toward the gradual inculcation and acceptance of far-right socially discriminatory ideals into increasingly mainstream social and political venues. Might move on from there. We can go back to some of these concepts as well in the chat if anything's unclear. So over the last several decades, a number of far-right political groupuscules, to use Griffin's term, and disorganised political tendencies in Australia have attempted to nominally associate their ideology or modes of organising with European identitarianism. So this often occurs through the short-lived establishment of social media profiles and associated online-only campaigns, or in limited instances through public protest activities. So examples have included Generation Identity Australia, a Facebook page that was administrated by Neil Erickson, a high-profile activist associated with many networks and groups in Australia over the years, including the neo-fascist nationalist alternative, the United Patriots Front, Patriot Blue, and more heterogeneous networks like Cook's Convicts, Reclaim Australia, Pauline Hanson's Guardian Angels, and the European Australian Civil Rights League. So Generation Identity Australia wasn't endorsed by Generation Identity leaders such as Sellner internationally, and that was perhaps owing to Erickson's historical self-identification as a neo-Nazi and his criminal convictions for offences related to racial and religious vilification. So the Generation Identity Facebook page was rebranded as Australians Resistance Network, the output of which has been described as anti-Muslim, anti-leftist, white nationalist propaganda. While the American Identity movement, Identity Canada and Identity Australia were also inspired by Generation Identity. So Identity Australia was one that was created in 2017. At the time of our research, it had a small but active ongoing membership in Melbourne, Brisbane and Sydney. And the chief ambition of Identity Australia administrators was stated in their now offline manifesto to raise the awareness of our plight and to galvanise racial consciousness in the millions of young Australians of European heritage through what it describes as a meta-political battle to instil a greater consciousness inside the hearts and minds of European-blooded Australians and win over as many people as we can. So members of Identity Australia were in 2018 observed to meet with the Dominion movement, which was a now dormant New Zealand-based identitarian group that transformed to become Action Zealandia, that I'll mention again a little bit later. So the popularity of New Right and identitarian aesthetics among far-right groups in the region was also demonstrated by the New Right Australia / New Zealand, a small, now inactive New Right political grouping. So one of its central figures, though, was one of the sort of self-described national anarchists, Welf Herfurth, who I'll also mention further below. According to its defunct website, the New Right Australia and New Zealand drew influence from traditionalists, the revolutionary conservatives, the Nouvelle Droite and the Eurasianists, while opposing liberalism, democracy and egalitarianism. So other Australia-based actors riffing on identitarian branding have included the Australian Identitarian Initiative Facebook group, which has been recently, when we were writing, documented to have 919 Facebook page members. Oh, actually, no, that was in 2019. In 2021, that's right, there were 824 members of the group, but it has a private status on Facebook and can't be accessed by non-members. So, excuse me. So while some far-right groups in Australia have branded themselves as overtly identitarian, a wider array of far-right and extreme-right actors engaged with currents of identitarian ideology, we argue, while also associating explicitly with ideas readily identifiable as neo-Nazi, white nationalist, or connected to an international counter-jihad movement. So these cases show how currents of identitarian ideology exist within wider ecosystems of far-right political thought, including through manifestations of political violence reinforced by the pastiche or combining together of disparate ideological dispositions. So unlike National Socialists, for example, young identitarian activists might seek to outwardly distance themselves from anti-Semitism, despite various leaders' personal histories of neo-Nazi activism. And for instance, Generation Identity's organizational citation of what it uses terms explicitly the Jewish question. So identitarians also tend to promote the idea of ethno-cultural separation and land-based geopolitical power blocks as an alternative to US-directed Western imperialism. So the international counter-jihad movement, by contrast, posits Western civilization with its neo-colonial and neoliberal aspirations to be under apocalyptic threat from the allegedly totalitarian religion of Islam. So Australian influence from the identitarian movement was widely recognised after the mass shooting in 2019 in Christchurch by an Australian-born neo-Nazi, and self-described fascist. The shooter's so-called manifesto was named the Great Replacement. He'd also, though, made several donations totalling £1,500 to Martin Sellner, the main leader of Generation Identity in Austria, and £2,200 to Les Identitaires, the group from which GI derived. In return for the donations, Sellner shared his personal email address, YouTube accounts, and an invitation to visit should Tarrant, the shooter, ever visit Austria. So indicating the transnational associations at play as well. The shooter also expressed support for Australian far-right organisations, the True Blue Crew and United Patriots Front, the latter of which he also donated money to, and praised the then UPF's well-known leader as Blair Cottrell as his emperor. So in the wake of the Christchurch attack, a New Zealand-based identitarian organisation called the Dominion Movement came under increased scrutiny, leading to its deletion of Facebook posts promoting identitarian ideology. So after the Dominion movement transformed to become Action Zealandia, the organisation was recognised by Tamaki Anti-Fascist Action and the White Rose Society for its support of the US-based neo-fascist identitarian group, Patriot Front, among other historical and contemporary neo-Nazi and neo-fascist actors. Its members were also recognised as regularly promoting the populationist myth of white New Zealand's decline. So New Zealand Action Zealandia member and notorious activist for neo-Nazism, Kerry Bolton, also had close ties to US-based white nationalist groups and announced the group's commitment to identitarianism. And he did so by citing the Christchurch shooter's connection to Generation Identity. So it's a bit of a tangle there, but I can give you, if anyone sort of requests, some of the references for where this information is coming from as well. So more populist far-right patriot groups in Australia have arguably provided the ideological political ferment from which the extreme end of this violent anti-Muslim prejudice derives. So echoing the anti-Islam ideologies of identitarian and counter-jihad activists in the international far-right, Australian patriot groups exhibited an aspect of propagandized divergence from earlier patterns of anti-Semitic prejudice prevalent among extreme right actors in extended periods. So Islamophobia in this context served as a new political strategy and target, which was conducive to global exploitation by white supremacist organisations in Australia as elsewhere. This is partly sort of accelerated, I won't go into here, but in the sort of wake of the xenophobic cultural aftershock following the Al-Qaeda attacks on Washington and New York on 9/11 and the commencement of the global war on terrorism. Okay, so Reclaim Australia was one of the first noteworthy Australian political movements in this regard. So led by extreme right and anti-Semitic neo-Nazi elements through its active period from 2015 to 2017, Reclaim's loose coalition of supporters primarily collectivised on the basis of indistinct economic and social concerns, coalescing around cultural xenophobia, targeting migrants and Muslim people primarily. So although the pseudo-intellectual orientation of identitarianism may at first appear discrete from the more majoritarian aspects of Reclaim, the movement held shared connections of influence as well as a mutual anti-Islam agenda. So organisational connections became apparent through events such as a 2015 Sydney Reclaim rally where attendees were seen bearing a flag with the insignia of the far-right pan-European anti-Islam movement Pegida, or Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamisation of the Occident. The French wing of Pegida was first founded by Renaud Camus, who was the developer of the Great Replacement theory. In the European context, Pegida members also advocate for, and as they did then, for a points-based system of immigration as a means of replicating Australia's approach to immigration. So Pegida offshoot branches exist in Australia, and a February 2016 Canberra rally attended by Reclaim members was part of a co-current series of demonstrations that was organised by people with Pegida branding in around a dozen European cities, including in Prague, Amsterdam and Birmingham. So the UPF was a high-profile derivative of Reclaim that also emerged in 2015 to more explicitly promote white supremacist and neo-Nazi views alongside the endorsement of violence against Muslim people. Although the UPF was perhaps more clearly neo-fascist than Generation Identity, connections between the UPF and the Identitarians have been explored by some people, including in an article that I worked on and published, which was looking at their sort of reflexive use of propaganda symbols and, for instance, mutual support of international anti-Semitic neo-fascist outfits such as, and organisations such as the now deregistered Greek political party Golden Dawn. So more recent offshoots of Reclaim in the UPF were led by Thomas Sewell, a former Reclaim member, second in command to Cottrell in the UPF. In 2017, Sewell established the Lads Society with UPF members and members of Antipodean Resistance, a violent Australian neo-Nazi network. In late 2020, the Melbourne branch of the Lads Society became the National Socialist Network, which was notorious for several high-profile stunts in early 2021, including around 40 of its members camping and displaying neo-Nazi insignia in the Grampians. Its assault of people that it believed were sort of spying on them. Innocent campers in the Cathedral Range, in Victoria's Cathedral Ranges, and also Sewell's public assault of a security guard working at Channel 9 after their airing of a episode in which the NSN was featured. So charges for these offences and others led to a counter-terrorism raid on the organisation's residential headquarters, and Sewell being remanded at the time of our research without bail. So the NSN identifies as an explicit neo-Nazi group. It might not be labelled identitarian in the European sense of the term, although its propaganda selectively incorporates European white identity imagery and discursive themes that are redolent of identitarian texts. So these characteristics of the NSN feature foremost on its former glossy website and members' communications via Telegram channels. So a central tenet of the NSN worldview, for example, is described on its website as the meta-political struggle, elaborated through blog posts to refer to a significant change in society's culture, philosophy, identity, and values resulting from the culture-bearing stratum of society, followed by the masses. And that's not their words, that's from somewhere else, but becoming disillusioned with the dominant societal worldview. Echoing the Great Replacement theory and other white genocide myths adopted by the extreme right globally, the NSN describe Australia, in their words, as a sinking ship owing to the founding race, i.e. white Australians, in their view, being denigrated, attacked, and replaced with foreigners. So you can sort of see very sort of explicit derivations and influence of, for instance, Great Replacement rhetoric and narratives. So the European Australian movement is also a white nationalist network that was led by Sewell, which also bears some symbolic ideological hallmarks reminiscent of identitarianism. So you can see this image on this slide is from the European Australian movement's Telegram page, sort of its version of Black Sun imagery. It doesn't maintain a current website through which it can develop its ideology, but the Telegram channel does, have an opening message which defines its aim to establish a physical and politicised white Australian community. So this recalls perhaps less the kind of countercultural activism of generational identity, but more so the differential racial identitarianism adopted by the European alt-right. It was also recalling David Lane's 14 words. The European Australian movement's mission statement is described on its website as the preservation and advancement of white people in Australia through building a network of white Australians across every city, suburb and town who are against the systematic replacement and destruction of white Australians. So there's also the Australian nativists. I won't go into too much detail, so don't have that much time left. But its opening Telegram post, and that was administrated, the Australian nativist, I don't think it's still active on Telegram, but was administrated by Sewell and Erickson. And its post was, we do not choose our own identities, but rather we are what we are because of what our parents and families are, not only by coincidence, but by the deliberate choice of the genome. Yeah, go on to the next. So a type of exclusionary sort of radical nativism, similar to the socio-biological basis of identitarianism, kind of has been apparent for some time in the politicking of elected Australian politicians. So there are notorious cases with Pauline Hanson when she was elected to federal parliament in 1996 on a Liberal Party ballot paper. She stated, "I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians." She then co-founded the One Nation Party as its only member for Parliament. So in a claim recognised by Finbo, who's written on her connections to identitarianism, in her book, Pauline Hanson, The Truth, her early book, which she since tried to deny authorship of. She elaborated claims about a plot developed by the internationalist elite of the New World Order, aiming to destroy Anglo-Saxon Australia through a process of immigrationism, multiculturalism, Asianisation, and Aboriginalism. So the book further posited what it termed the Aboriginal question. So Hanson spoke at a Reclaim rally in 2015 and came to prominence again in 2016 after winning a seat in the Senate election. So differing from her early refrain, in this instance, she targeted primarily Muslim people and immigration, but also promoting a familiar, socially discriminatory position that Australians have become second-class citizens in their country due to a national government pandering to the interests of so-called minorities. In 2018, October, she tabled a motion, "It's okay to be white," which was derived from a white supremacist meme on 4chan, and that was only defeated in the Senate 28 votes to 31 after a recount. In 2021, her June motion to ban critical race theory from a national curriculum passed 28 votes to 30 after the word ban was replaced with restrict. There's also the example of Fraser Anning that I might leave for now because most people are probably familiar with his example. Noteworthy that his so-called final solution speech called for a final solution to the problem of Australia's immigration policy. And the European New Right ideas are sort of well captured by this phrase spoken by him and potentially authored by other sort of far-right figures. I'll explain hopefully in a minute. He said, "I believe that we must look to the work of the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Gramsci's insight was to see revolution in cultural rather than economic terms, with cultural hegemony as the key to supposed class dominance." So it's important, though, to recognise the historical resonances of some of these expressions. And that's not even necessarily confined, to parties that were always on the sort of further right of a political spectrum. So that said, notwithstanding as well, some early sort of aspects of racial politics and the formation of the Australian Labor Party, often under-recognised is sort of Graham Campbell, the former ALP member for Parliament's for Kalgoorlie, politician, presented a conference paper by Dennis McCormack, which was titled The Grand Plan, Asianisation of Australia, in the Australian House of Reps in October 1996. He also went on to be the former of the Australia First Party, which is now and was, subsequently then led by Jim Salim, who might not have space to talk about too much. So the influence of identitarianism within Australian institutional politics is unconfined. I suppose that's the important part as well, just to marginal political groupings on the far right. So it becomes apparent, particularly in light of the sort of high-profile intersections between the politicking strategies of right-wing sort of political parties that were recently in government and identitarian activists. So one well-known case was the Liberal National Coalition's Operation Sovereign Borders, which is still nominally in place and effectively in place in certain contexts. So representing again, the further militarisation of maritime border patrols. The policy was initiated by the Abbott-led government, but its talking points expressed through Border Force YouTube videos were since also taken up and imitated, as you can see, by Geert Wilders, who has other political connections within Australia, but also by Generation Identity, as well, as you can see the figure at the bottom here. So Wilders also, has links to Australia through his historical support for Pegida, but he also attended a meeting of the Islamophobic Q Society of Australia in Somerton, Victoria in February 2013. He also launched the Australian Liberty Alliance in Perth in October 2015. And the policies of the Australian Liberty Alliance included removing Australia from the UN Refugee Convention, banning facial coverings, and introducing a 10-year moratorium on visa applications by people from Muslim countries. So some long-standing, though more amorphous connections also exist in fields that are intersectional with, but don't exclusively belong to the realms of professional politics or networked modes of organised activism. Just think of what example. Sorry, we'll wrap up and give you time for questions in a minute. So perhaps just to elaborate again on the example of Salim briefly, it's important as well the contributions of sort of academics and far-right intellectuals, or in some cases pseudo-intellectuals, you could say as well. So Frank Salter, Andrew Fraser, and Jim Salim. So Jim Salim's, I suppose, sort of extensive contributions included so his early membership of the Australian Nazi Party, the establishment of National Action in 1982, but although his leadership of National Action was suspended when he was incarcerated for coordinating a shotgun assault on the home of Sydney-based ANC representative Eddie Fund in 1989. Since the mid-2000s, Salim has been the leader of the AFP, the slogan for which is restoring nationhood and wealth for Australians. So it was founded in 1996, as I said, by former Labor politician Graham Campbell. And the AFP also organises, or has organised again on several occasions, or sought to organise and found youth wings, including the Patriotic Youth League or the Eureka Youth League projects. So Salim, his doctoral thesis, includes a chapter in which he discusses the French Nouvelle Droite as an ideological inspiration for re-establishing or establishing Australia as a white ethno-state. So as he articulates it, so how the new ideological initiatives integrated the radical nationalist mythos with strategic tactical ideas drawn from Australian and foreign left and right ideologies. So this idea again of the sort of proto-fascist third or new way, representing sort of a syncretic, often superficial sort of adaptation and appropriation of popular ideas from disparate political sources. So a dedicated RADNAT website blog administered by Salim functions as a repository of writings by de Benoit, and as well as from US, German and Croatian neo-fascist intellectuals, Francis Parker Yockey, Oswald Spengler and Tomislav Sunic. Under Stormfront, he's blogged extensively under the nom de guerre RADNAT as well. Just to finish off, then I'd just say, so obviously these are just a few connections of influence. It's not really extensive in showing maybe the sort of I guess different degrees of connection between identitarian inspired activists in institutional versus non-institutional settings. And as I said as well, it's sort of several of the examples I think indicate the placement of sort of identitarian inspired ideas and symbols and rhetoric in the context of a wider amalgam of different far right ideological traditions. So some of these ideas of identitarianism are also difficult to sustain within Australia. So particularly this idea about opposing so-called Islamization have been, in the European context, reliant to some degree upon claims to indigeneity and the expressed desire to return a given territory to native peoples and protect Indigenous European cultures. As I said, this is sort of argued despite early histories of conflict across European regions, and that most of the populations in question could also be considered early migrants themselves. But notwithstanding those dynamics, the matter of indigeneity obviously presents distinct challenges for Australia-based actors' adoption of identitarian brands of white supremacy. So Australia's settler colonial history is, by contrast, of course, with many European countries, marked by the genocide of those who had occupied the mainland for at least 65,000 years, and the long-term Sikh-Alai frontier massacres, the stolen generation and routine forced displacement, are still experienced widely today. So in certain respects, the feature of identitarian principles is, alongside other ideologies, is, in certain respects foreseeable, given the national policy history of the Immigration Restriction Act, otherwise known as the White Australia Policy, from 1901 to its eventual renunciation in 1973, prescribed almost exclusively European immigration to Australia. But again, geopolitically, the narratives of ethno-pluralism demarcating in identitarian terms a Europe of nations are difficult to sustain in the context of Australia's colonial federation of states. And regional connections between identitarian politics in Australia and New Zealand might also become coherent in this light, given the structural influence of both, former British colonies, extractivists as well, models of development. So these and other insights about the uses of identitarianism, and I think important to frame it in those terms as uses, the extent to which these sorts of tropes and ideologies are politically expedient and work, and the ways in which they don't. So this can reveal tensions within the wider movement itself relating to the imperial and current powers in question. And this analysis might also provide a more effective means by which to sort of unpack, understand where they come from, and then think about ways in which to challenge the narratives and premises of identitarianism. So I might stop there then and give you time for any questions.
Well, thanks so much, Imogen, for that really comprehensive presentation. Really appreciate all of your insights into this issue. So I'll just remind people once again, just to put any questions that you might have in the Q&A, because we're going to be doing the Q&A portion right now. We have one already, and the question to you, Imogen, is, can you expand on the concept of metapolitics? Is this a widely held conceptualization across identitarian activists?
Sure. So, excuse me, sorry. So I think an important aspect of what's already been written about metapolitics and you know, from where it derives is it's gone. So often I guess at least insofar as its uses by the Identitarian and European New Right, or the French New Right, it could be seen to be something, again, of that kind of proto-fascist syncretic, at least in Roger Griffin's sort of description, tendency toward, you know, adapting cultural ideas which are likely to gain, I guess, ideological propagandizing purchase within a popular community. So often this means that, you know, metapolitical ideas and metapolitical campaigns fundamentally are countercultural. So they construct themselves sort of in opposition to a political mainstream. They also, you know, aren't uniquely, you know, contemporary, even though people often, you know, some sort of writers would cite exclusively Gramsci and exclusively the sort of 1968 cultural revolutions as a left-wing inspiration for it. These types of ideas of building ideological hegemony, it very much also taps into those longer theories of how a wider population can become acculturated to ideas which might be antithetical to their actually wider majoritarian material interests, I suppose. And so in that way, we can see it as part of, although it has these sort of countercultural premises and uses of alt tech and alt media, very much a part as well of a wider ecosystem, which is largely about developing ideological consensus. So I'm not sure if that has really helped, but now, you know, often with reference to the far right, particularly the US alt-right sort of Chan culture, you know, you'll see people citing techniques, new techniques, which are seen to be sometimes countercultural or subcultural, niche, trendy. So it might involve gamification, you know, online gaming cultures, or at least the gamification. So Generation Identity developed a sort of an alt-right, you know, alternative reality, Patriot universe game, for instance. But also, you know, the play on popular fashions. So often, you know, you'll see actors, so influential, you know, propaganda actors on popular white nationalist fora talk about the need to imitate, and not just within the Australian or US context, but cross-nationally, you know, hipster fashions and this sort of thing. So primarily it's referring to the idea of achieving a cultural societal consensus in a direction that you want it to before sort of hard politics or more forceful, coercive mechanisms of achieving a political end that you want. It's about that consensus building, and it's supposed to operate sort of without institutions before eventually, achieving those more transformative, revolutionary aims. And in the identitarian context, that is about, you know, ethnocultural, but really like ethnic separation. And I suppose maybe just as a final note on that, I think the you know, this idea again of ethno-pluralism or, you know, separation as well is primarily ahistorical, in that it's not taking account of neocolonial and imperial histories and the implications of, you know, borders and deriving or depriving access to communications resources for people who might historically have facilitated, for instance, the development of some European countries, for instance. So at first instance, it's about separation, but also has these implicitly very violent connotations. Yeah, it's very long.
No, thanks, Imogen. We have another question coming in, and it asks about the role of foreign actors. So what role do foreign actors in the far right have in the identitarian movement? You spoke about it kind of as a global international movement, so it's hard to say who's foreign and who isn't. But I'm assuming that this is in relation to the Australian context. So non-Australian actors have in the far right and identitarian movement in Australia.
Yeah, so I would say, especially because of the nature, I suppose it's a sort of a typical kind of truism, now, referring to the online nature of these communications, the way that sort of metapolitical propaganda works, the cross-national fomentation and encouragement of these ideas and dissemination of these propagandized sort of ideas. So by virtue of really just the cross-national nature, I guess, of white nationalist ideologies, sort of even now as in modern history in different sorts of ways, it's intrinsically, I guess, an international movement, so that's both in its sort of recursive justification as an anti-globalization movement, which is more about place and territory as opposed to what it would term sea-based politics. That might be a bit abstract. I was going to say, so yeah, I had another point about yeah, I'll just have a bit of a think on that if I can, remember the sort of way I was going to try to address that.
Yeah, but broadly speaking, your point that it's an international movement is well taken. I'm wondering if I could ask you about the movement and its potential for violence. So you spoke about obviously how it had inspired the Christchurch attacker, but I'm wondering if you could talk a bit more about how it's intersected with more recent lone actor attacks of mass violence. We've seen great replacement, identitarian tropes kind of referenced in some of the more recent mass attacks by lone actors. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about that.
Sure. I do just remember, just on the previous question, one sort of point, which I might just add on to that as well. And it kind of leads into answering your question, Lydia.
Mm-hmm.
I think, in this last point of what I was talking about, the aspects of identitarianism, European identitarianism, that might be difficult to sustain within an Australian context. There are, other claims of sort of neo-colonial white supremacy, I should say, which sort of in certain respects might be said to collect these sort of Australian patriots and US alt-right. It's sort of the idea of people of European ancestry might not have been in those lands for as long, but they've earned it by virtue of the sort of iconography and imagery such as displayed on the last sort of slide which I showed, which isn't here anymore. But it's sort of the ideas of I think definitely, if you look at different settler colonial contexts, some of the narratives of identitarianism are sort of reshaped for, and purpose to fit as well, if that helps. So in terms of the potential contributions or ideological, uses in the context of political violence, I think you were saying, sort of, Lydia, obviously it's been replacement ideas in the context of a recent mass shooting in Buffalo. It was in large part featured not just through that shooter's heavily exerting of Brenton Tarrant's manifesto from Christchurch, which was named the Great Replacement. But also, there are specific kind of examples that you're sort of thinking of specific types of violence and acts of violence.
Well, I think it seems to manifest itself in two different sets of violence. So it's like mass casualty attacks, either committed by one individual or a small group of individuals, but also it could kind of lead to more lower levels of violence and societal discord as well. So incidents of kind of racist attacks or, smaller type of incidences that cumulatively add up. but we might pay less attention to. And I'm wondering what you think would be the role of identitarianism in kind of fomenting those kind of smaller scale types of destabilizing violence to society that don't maybe receive as much attention, but also to the high profile attacks, and how they seem to have feature these ideas over and over again.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, so I think that the idea of a, demographic replacement, the predication of, white supremacist ideologies on white identity victimhood is not new, obviously. It's it sort of, I guess, creates a lower entry point for identification with these ideals, which are more and less explicitly very violent, by, constructing fear, by false narratives. I think at the moment, potentially, these sort of ahistorical, counterfactual, socially prejudicial narratives and views, usage of, uncritical usages of words such as replacement, is very much a part of that ecosystem of Tucker Carlson and Fox News, but more widely sort of the counterfactual tenor of public information right now. And I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're after, but I think, what might be contributing to this as well is, I guess, the notion of sort of anti-intellectualism broadly writ, which has its obvious kind of historical currents as well, but a sort of an undermining of the importance, or access to, but also understanding of the importance of, information, critical thinking, developed narratives, and so on. And again, this is, so I'm trying to resist using the word post-truth, but the idea of fake news, post-truth, plethora of information and proliferation of information online, and, sort of a reduced capacity within the US as here, to be able to process and, discern, well-constructed arguments, and the actual realities and status of victimhood and where those problems are coming from. So rather than obviously the reasons for economic strain, the narratives that are sold are obviously the replacement narratives. So, there's so many, I guess, grievances that are accessed, but, a primary one is economic, as again, it has been historically in the context of the wider circulation of counterfactual news and white genocide conspiracy theses. So obviously there are much wider impacts in all sorts of different violence, physical violence, violence even in respect, as I was saying, of denying access so even in the context of border policies, I would say, but that's not to say one type of violence is equivalent with another, but to see the connections between them is sort of important, and increasingly so as well in the context of social, ecological, health crises. The idea of unequal resources and a lack of comprehension of this and the historical, factors of contribution to this, targeting rather, those people which are most marginalised is obviously the sort of structural systemic violence, which has potential to grow, is already in certain contexts, certainly in the realm of dealing with obviously ecological, environmental, climate crisis and pandemic related illness and disease we can see at the moment. So yeah, hope that helps.
Well, thanks so much, Imogen. I'm afraid we've run up against time. I've had many more questions for you, but we want to sincerely thank you, and I'm sure everyone attending will join me in sincerely thanking you for this presentation. This will soon be available to view later on the AVERT Research Network website, and we'll send out a notification about that. In the meantime, thank you so much for your attendance, for staying with us, And we look forward to letting you know about our upcoming webinar next month. So be on the lookout either on our website or on the Twitter feed about news for that. Thank you again, everybody. Have a great evening.